America was a continent inhabited by its own indigenous peoples long before any European power arrived. But in 1492, Christopher Columbus's voyage, sponsored by the Spanish crown, brought this continent into Europe's awareness, and after this point, the Spanish, French, and English began settling different regions of the continent and establishing their own colonial systems. The Spanish pushed from the Caribbean into Mexico and down through South America, building a vast sphere of control across the southern part of the continent, and the city of St. Augustine, founded in 1565, is recognized as the oldest European settlement on what is now United States soil. The Spanish goal here was clear: seize gold and silver and assimilate native peoples into Spanish religion and culture. If you had to pick one European power's approach to colonization as the most ruthless, which would it be, and why? The French took a different path. Rather than settling and building large colonies, they centered their efforts on Quebec and pushed a fur trading network from the St. Lawrence River through the Great Lakes and down into the Mississippi Basin, forming alliances with native tribes to secure that trade. The English arrival came in 1607, when a group of settlers financed by the Virginia Company of London founded the town of Jamestown on the James River. But in these early years, the colonists, driven by hopes of finding gold and precious metals, neglected farming entirely, and as a result, the majority of the original settlers died of starvation and disease. Finding no gold, the colony eventually survived by turning to tobacco cultivation. 13 years later, in 1620, a group that included Puritan separatists seeking religious freedom set sail from Plymouth, England, crossed the Atlantic aboard the Mayflower, and landed in what is now the state of Massachusetts, founding Plymouth Colony. Unlike the settlers at Jamestown, these colonists hadn't come for commercial gain, but to escape religious persecution in England. Yet the brutality of that first winter struck just as hard, and more than half the settlers died. Jamestown came for profit. Plymouth came for faith. If you'd had to cross the Atlantic in the 1600s, which colony would you have joined? And which risk would you have rather faced, starvation or persecution? Throughout the 17th century, the English rapidly expanded along America's eastern coast, and by 1733, these settlements had become a colonial system of 13 colonies under the British Empire. Each colony had its own governor, its own assembly, but all of them ultimately answered to the English crown. As these colonies pushed westward, they collided with the French-controlled Ohio Valley. The French wanted to secure that valley to protect their fur trade routes coming down from Canada, while the English colonies needed new land for farming and had their eyes on the same territory. In 1749, a group of Virginia land investors formed the Ohio Company and claimed nearly 500,000 acres in the valley. The French responded by building a chain of forts in the region, and tension between the two empires kept rising, even though no formal war had been declared yet. It was in the middle of this tension, in 1754, that 22-year-old George Washington, serving in the Virginia militia, led a raid against French forces that resulted in the death of French commander Jumonville, an event that historians point to as the spark of what became known as the French and Indian War. As the English historian Horace Walpole put it, the single shot fired in America's remote forests would soon set the world on fire. A 22-year-old militia officer's decision ended up triggering a war that spanned multiple continents. Do you think Washington bears real responsibility for what happened next? Or was this conflict inevitable, with or without him? Shortly after this, Washington built a fortification he named Fort Necessity, but in July 1754, French forces laid siege to it and forced his surrender. This was the first defeat of his military career, but not the last, because a year later, in 1755, when a 2,200-strong British army under General Edward Braddock marched into the Ohio Valley to seize Fort Duquesne, Washington volunteered to join the expedition. Braddock wanted to fight using classic European tactics, but the French and their native allies preferred to hide and ambush from within the forest. Washington tried to warn Braddock of this difference, but Braddock wouldn't listen, and as a result, the British Army was ambushed and devastated along the banks of the Monongahela River, with more than 900 soldiers killed or wounded. Braddock himself was mortally wounded and died a few days later. The conflict that began with this defeat soon spread to Europe, Asia, and Africa, becoming the global war known as the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763 with a British victory. France lost the majority of its North American territory, but that victory came at a steep financial cost to Britain, and to cover it, London began imposing new taxes on the colonies. The Stamp Act of 1765 demanded a tax on every piece of paper, every newspaper, even playing cards in the colonies, but the colonies had no representation in the parliament that imposed this tax, so the backlash was severe, and the law was repealed shortly after. But the Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed new taxes on goods, including tea, and tensions rose once again. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry. Looking at today's world, are there modern examples of people being taxed, regulated, or governed by a body they have no real voice in? This rising tension culminated in 1770, when an argument between a civilian and a British soldier in Boston escalated into a crowd hurling stones and snowballs at troops. The soldiers opened fire, killing 5 Americans, and the event became known as the Boston Massacre. 3 years later, in 1773, a group of Americans disguised as Native Americans boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped tons of tea into the water, an event remembered as the Boston Tea Party. In response, Parliament passed far harsher laws, closed the port of Boston, and effectively declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. From this point forward, both sides began to see armed conflict as inevitable. In April 1775, British troops marched out under General Thomas Gage's orders to seize weapons and gunpowder stored in Concord. But thanks to Paul Revere and William Dawes riding through the night to warn the countryside, colonial militia were ready and waiting in Lexington. No one knows for certain who fired first, but 8 American militiamen were killed in the encounter. The British continued toward Concord, where another clash broke out at the bridge. This time, the British were forced to retreat. Nobody knows who fired the first shot at Lexington. Does it matter who started it, or does the outcome, 8 dead militiamen and a war that followed, matter more than the cause? The British retreat to Boston turned into an 18-mile gauntlet, as thousands of militia fired on them from behind trees and stone walls the entire way. By the end of the day, the British had suffered more than 73 dead and 174 wounded. This clash would later be remembered as the shot heard round the world, the official start of the American Revolutionary War. In the aftermath, nearly 20,000 militia laid siege to Boston, trapping British forces inside the city. In June 1775, after learning of a British plan to seize the hills around Charlestown, the colonists ordered Colonel William Prescott to fortify Bunker Hill. But for reasons that remain unclear, Prescott instead chose nearby Breed's Hill, where his men dug in overnight. British General William Howe launched an assault of more than 2,300 men to retake the hill, but the colonial militia held their fire until the last possible moment and repelled 2 British charges, only to run out of ammunition on the 3rd assault and lose the position. Technically, the British won the battle, but at a cost of nearly 1,000 casualties compared to roughly 450 on the colonial side, making it a victory bought at a brutal price. The British won Bunker Hill, but lost nearly twice as many men as the colonists. Would you call that a real victory? What does it take for a win to actually count as a win? At this point, the siege of Boston had reached a stalemate because the colonists had no heavy artillery capable of striking the British Navy or the forces inside the city. The man who solved this problem was 25-year-old Henry Knox, a former Boston bookseller who proposed transporting 59 captured cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. Washington approved the plan. In November 1775, Knox set out, hauling more than 60 tons of cannon across frozen rivers, ice-covered lakes, and mountainous terrain, using sledges and ox carts. A journey that took 56 days and is still regarded by historians as one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the war. A 25-year-old bookseller with no military training pulled off what historians call one of the greatest logistical feats of the war. What do you think matters more in moments like this? Experience or sheer stubbornness? In March 1776, those cannons were quietly hauled up to Dorchester Heights overnight. When morning came, the British woke up to find the guns aimed directly at their ships and the harbor, and realized the city could no longer be defended. A snowstorm prevented the planned British assault, and on March 17, 1776, General Howe loaded his troops and the Loyalists fleeing with him onto ships and withdrew to Halifax, bringing the 11-month siege of Boston to an end. But at this point, the colonies still hadn't formally declared independence. They were still, on paper, subjects of the English crown. 11 months had passed since Lexington. Thousands killed or wounded, a city besieged, the British driven out, but the word independence had yet to appear in any official document. That word would emerge a few months later, in a declaration drafted by Thomas Jefferson at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and on July 4, 1776, the colonies would step out of colonial status and onto the path of becoming an independent nation. But the road to that declaration had been paved by the defeat at Fort Necessity, the slaughter at Monongahela, the 8 bodies at Lexington, and the costly victory at Bunker Hill. It had taken years to get there. Knowing everything that happened before July 4th, was independence inevitable from the start? Or could things have gone very differently